One of the interesting things about therapy is that as you start to heal, you have a lot of grieving to do of all of this time in your life where healing wasn't an option. It might seem counterintuitive that some part of me wants to keep thinking of myself as someone who doesn't fit in. But if I fit in now, then does that mean I could have fit in all that time when I was young and I spent all that time just in the wrong environment, and the people who should have seen that I wasn't fitting in weren't able to do that? And there's all of this really tough stuff that you have to then face and accept. And so often the way that we keep that from having to be is that we just convince ourselves, no, nothing has changed. Nothing can change. I'll just keep doing things the way I've always done them. So there really is a lot of grief, I think, that you have to tolerate if you want to grow.
Welcome to Good Work, the long-form interview show about the inner journey of outward success. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks. On this show, I talk with talented creators, entrepreneurs, authors, artists, and athletes about what it really takes to become world-class and to live a thoughtful life. My guest today is Dr. Emily Anhalt, a clinical psychologist, founder, and writer who spent the last 15 years exploring what it really means to be emotionally healthy. Maybe you've seen her TED Talk on emotional fitness or followed her work on Twitter or at COA, the mental health startup she founded. But what you might not know is the deeper story behind her work, one that starts in childhood classrooms shaped by ADHD, self-experimentation, and an early fascination with why people become who they are. In this conversation, Emily and I talk about what it's like to grow up in Silicon Valley, not just the place, but the mentality. We dive into her decision to leave pre-med and pursue psychology, the invisible cost of being a high-achieving kid, and the unprocessed grief that so many successful people carry with them long after we make it. We also talk about what makes therapy actually work, what happens when you reach all your goals and still feel lost, and how emotional patterns from childhood can show up in your business, your leadership, and your relationships until you decide to confront them. If you're the kind of person who's built something meaningful but still struggles to feel at peace, or if you've ever wondered what's beneath the ambition that drives you, this one's for you. Let's get to it. Emily Anhalt, welcome to the show.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yes. A little maybe fun context, maybe no one will care, but a little fun context here is we actually first planned on doing a version of this, I think 5 years ago when the pandemic started, on Clubhouse, which I don't even know if anyone listening to this will know Clubhouse ever existed at this point. But it's been a long time coming, so I'm excited to chat with you. And my first question is, I'm curious if you could tell us a story about when you realized that being comfortable in your chair was a key ingredient to being able to do good work every day.
What do you mean when you say being comfortable in your chair? Because I've never been uncomfortable in my chair because I have ADHD. I hate sitting still in chairs. So what do you mean exactly?
I've heard this story that you've told about how you realized that part of the ingredient for success of you being able to focus on doing good work is physically being comfortable in your chair, and how you came to that realization and what led to that basically.
Sure. So I was this raging ADHD kid, and I really struggled to sit still and to pay attention. And I went to this school where most of the kids were very well behaved, and I was the rambunctious one that frustrated all of the teachers. And I really got this idea about myself that I just wasn't a good learner, because that is what it felt like in this setting. And my parents put me on meds really young for ADHD, and I hated how they made me feel. You know, they made me shaky and anxious, and I lost my appetite. I didn't sleep as well. I mean, it's essentially, amphetamines. It did not do good things to my little 7-year-old body. And I was on the meds for a bit. And at some point, as I got a little older, I realized I don't like this. I don't want to be on these meds anymore. And so I started secretly flushing them down the toilet when my parents weren't looking. But I had enough awareness to realize that they would figure that out if I didn't change my behavior to what had been explained to me was necessary. And so I started running little experiments on myself about how I could do a better job of sitting still and being focused and not interrupting people and all of that. And one of the things that I realized is that when I'm physically uncomfortable, it's extra difficult for me to sit still. And this one was helped through a teacher I had a science teacher who could tell that I was a little ADHD kid. And instead of kicking me out of the classroom, which is what a lot of the teachers did, she accommodated me in all these cool ways. So, for example, where everyone else was sitting on these uncomfortable chairs, she let me sit in a beanbag in the back of the classroom. And I noticed that I paid such better attention because I was comfortable and I could kind of fidget without it bothering everyone. And so I just started to learn these lessons about myself. And so I ended up doing my doctoral research on ADHD and success in adults and gathering stories from other adults. And ultimately, what came to be clear is that adults that figured out how to accommodate their learning and work environment to how their brain works instead of the other way around were more successful. And so the way I do that is I do all of my work from a really comfortable chair, and I do it with a snack nearby and, all the things that I need to settle my nervous system so that I can focus.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating example that I can relate to so much. Just doing all the research for this episode just took me back to so many things about childhood, school. I got kicked out of so many classes growing up. And really the only way I learned to focus was if the teachers would give me the assignment for that night's homework and I could do that in class, I wouldn't interrupt.
Nice.
And so that became my strategy for getting through school was I would do that night's homework during class because I often did not require what was happening up in the front of the classroom to get it done. And then I could go home and I could just go run around outside and play and do all of these things. But when I was either done with the homework or just being me, it was not good. And I have these very vivid memories of things like my one math teacher, I think this was 10th grade, had these two exercises she would have me do. She'd have me go get the dictionary and write the definition of run 100 times. Run takes up in a very large dictionary about 3 pages. It's like to canter, to gallop, to whatever. And then the other is she would have me do 1,000 minus 2 equals, 998 plus 1 equals 999 minus 2 equals 997. Wow. And just write that until I would get to 0. And the point, of course, was there was no way I could finish these things in the allotted time in that class. And the goal was just to get me to shut up.
What an interesting, feels repetitive, but if it worked, it worked. I think my version of that is I started doodling really young. I have all kinds of really fascinating drawings that I've done, got me through middle school, got me through high school, got me through grad school. And it's funny to watch my doodles change over time.
That's an interesting I bet there's some interesting just kind of analyses one could do on that.
For sure.
So you grew up in Silicon Valley.
Yes.
And most people kind of in our space of entrepreneurship and startups and all of this don't grow up in Silicon Valley. They go to Silicon Valley because they want to be a part of the culture there. And it strikes me that it's a very unique experience to both have grown up there and then also be in a space that is entrepreneurial, working with entrepreneurs and founders. And I'm just curious how that's been to live your whole life there and, or at least to grow up there and then to end up working there for a period of time.
I don't know any other way, so it's hard to compare. But yeah, I grew up right in the heart of Silicon Valley. I went to the same high school that Steve Jobs and Steve Woz went to. Everyone kind of around me was involved in tech in one way or another. And I think more than anything, what it did was plant this seed of possibility that you don't necessarily have to do a job that already exists. You can kind of create something new for yourself. And I was lucky to have the support to do that, which again, I think works really well with my ADHD, that instead of trying to cram my mind into a pre-existing box, I kind of thought to myself, well, what am I good at? What do I like to do? How can I craft a career out of that? And the environment of Silicon Valley made that really possible. And then compound that with when I was in grad school, starting to learn how to be a psychologist, you train with people who obviously live in the area where you're training. And so all of the patients I was training on were people in tech because I was right in San Francisco. And so I really learned how to think psychologically in relation to people who were doing this kind of work. So I got exposed from all these different angles. And then eventually I started a company myself. I co-founded a startup and got to experience it from this new, very insider kind of view. And that really shaped how I show up as well.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I was going to ask about kind of how you made the choice to focus on entrepreneurs, but it makes sense that if that's just the population who's showing up as you're training in psychology and supporting them, that it's kind of natural.
Yeah, that was a big part of it. I think, though, I also thought about all of my friends, all of my family were at these tech companies, and they would come to me and tell me what was going on and what it was like to work under these tech giants. And I started to notice how much these tech companies were deciding a lot about our culture of Silicon Valley, but everywhere, right? You know, the people who are running the biggest tech companies are making choices that affect everyone in the world. And
Yes.
I would not necessarily say that the people running these biggest tech companies are a picture of mental health. And so I thought, you know, the more mentally and emotionally healthy these leaders are, the better it actually is for all of us. It's almost like supporting the parents of culture to be healthier so they don't leak all their shit onto all of the kids. And so I found a lot of interest in seeing that when you support leaders in becoming more mentally healthy, the employees benefit, the company benefits, the customers benefit, the society benefits.
Yeah. And I want to talk a bunch about supporting leaders and the psychology of success and all of that, especially in the second half of our conversation. And so for now, I just want to stay focused on kind of your experience growing up and getting into this field. And I'm just noting for listeners that we'll come back to this, I promise. You are kind of a typical case of the type of person I have on this podcast because you're an expert at what you do. You're well known on social media. You've done a great job of building a following and kind of making yourself known in your field. And as a result of that, almost every podcast I listen to with you as the guest just peppers you with these tactical questions. It's like such a reflection of the logic center of the Western world and how we just want to know the answer and give me the thing right now. And I don't think I heard a single interview that asked you about your story and your journey. You know, you volunteered it in some cases, but something I was really curious about is how did your parents end up in Silicon Valley and what kind of work were they doing as you were growing up?
Sure. So my parents are both from New York. My whole extended family is from New York. And they moved to Palo Alto for their medical residency just before I was born. So they were not initially in tech. They are both physicians. But my mom is one of those people who would really prefer learning to actually, you know, having to do the things. So my mom has an MD, a PhD, 2 masters, double bachelors. She just loves school. And so through all of this in Silicon Valley, she did end up getting pulled into the tech world as well. But that, you know, my exposure to all that came a little less from my parents. My godparents, who I spent quite a lot of time with when I was young, were really in the heart of tech. My godfather, I guess you'd call him, he sold a company to Bill Gates at one point, and I got to watch this crazy process of, oh, you can make something that wasn't there before and then leverage it into this crazy life, you know, what's possible. So that was a lot of the exposure. And then once I got older myself here, then all of my friends were in tech, and so I got to see things that way.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So you've talked about the ways that ADHD kind of shaped your experience as a young person, and you did a lot of research on this that was really fascinating. I think I listened to like an hour-long, almost lecture you did on your findings from your dissertation. And I found it fascinating that the study, unbeknownst to you, was funded by a pharmaceutical company, as I understand it. And you basically gave findings that were kind of like the opposite of what they might hope for, I would imagine, which was like, here's how you can succeed without needing medication to treat ADHD. And I find that really fascinating that you seem to have been very pulled towards, well, how can we use this thing that is stigmatized in society as a superpower, as a thing that we can use to our advantage? And I wonder when you made that shift from like, my internal story about this thing has been absorbed through the world I occupy every day to, well, hold on a minute. There seems like there might be something pretty powerful here. And let me go focus on that part of it as well. Like, how did that shift happen?
I think naturally over time, I realized that my ADHD could be beneficial in my life. You know, it's a pain in the ass in a lot of ways, don't get me wrong. And it's gotten me into trouble and it's made certain relationships more complicated. So I'm not trying to say ADHD is a walk in the park, but there are things I am able to do that people with neurotypical brains seem less able to do. I genuinely can focus on more than one thing at once. In fact, I need there to be more than one thing happening in order to focus. I can switch focus between things really easily. I can hyper focus on something I find interesting. I'm good at things like puns and brainstorming because my brain will jump around naturally to unusual places, that kind of thing. The game Taboo, I'm really good at, where you have to describe a word without using common words because my mind will jump to all of the less common words that a person might associate. And so at some point I realized, oh, I actually wouldn't give this ADHD up even if I could. And I wonder if other people feel that way too. So when it was time to do a doctoral dissertation, I thought it'd be worth talking to other people who believe that their ADHD helped them be successful. I'm not against medication. I think some people need it. Some people benefit from it.
Of course.
That's all well and good. But I felt that I actually did better without it. And I found this handful of successful ADHD adults who also felt that they did better without it. And so hearing all of their stories really drove home this idea of it's not a coincidence that a lot of those people that I found are in leadership positions and they're CEOs and founders, and they're having to change their mindset and their focus 100 times a day. And they get to choose what kind of people they work with rather than necessarily having to deal with people who don't like the ADHD way of doing things, that kind of thing. And just hearing their stories really, really validated this lifetime of, this thing can be kind of a force for good if you know how to harness it.
Certainly, ADHD was an influence in kind of your upbringing and your early experience of life, but it also wasn't the only thing, obviously, because it's never the only thing.
Right.
I'm curious, what were the other major kind of shaping forces in your life as a young person and an adolescent as you approached high school and then went on to study psychology?
So I'm from a psychologically minded family. My grandfather was a psychiatrist. My mom is very psychologically minded. There was a lot of space and permission in my family to think about how our emotions were at play in various ways. I was in therapy very young for the ADHD, so that was sort of destigmatized for me early. And then, let's be real, therapists do not become therapists by accident. There's also a ton of mental illness in my family that I'm sure I was trying to understand and figure out. And so in high school, I had this incredible psychology teacher. He was a really unique human. He wasn't actually a psychologist, or I don't think he even had a degree in high school. That's how public school goes, I guess. But he would do these wonderful projects for us where we had to psychologically analyze one of the US presidents, or, we could bring our dreams in at recess and he would analyze them. I guess he wasn't really qualified to do that, but he would. And he just instilled this love of psychology in me. And then one day I was in his classroom and I saw this book on his bookshelf called The Psychopathology of Serial Killers. And I picked up this book and he's like, if you find that interesting at all, you should read it. I ended up reading it, and the whole book was essentially tracing serial killers' particular breed of, sociopathy to their childhood experiences. Like, how did this particular kind of trauma as a kid lead to this particular kind of insanity as an adult? And one of the things the book showed is that something like 98.9% of serial killers were abused as children. So this locked in for me this idea of like, oh shit, the more you understand about a person's past and life, the more you'll kind of understand where they will eventually go. And this idea of if you learn the language of psychology, then you'll know a little about everything, because psychology is just the study of relationships, and the whole world is spoken in the language of relationships. So that solidified an interest in it. So then I go to college, and because my parents are both physicians and I wanted to be a good daughter that they were proud of, I was pre-med, and I hated it. I was doing very badly in biology and chemistry and physics. I wasn't enjoying myself. And I went to my college advisor and I said, how the hell am I going to get into med school with these grades and these classes? She's like, do you like biology and chemistry and physics? And I said, no, I hate all of them. She said, then why are you pre-med? And I said, well, I want my parents to be proud of me. And she's like, that's not a good enough reason. That's not a good reason. What do you actually love? And I said, well, I love my psychology classes and I love my philosophy classes. I want to try to answer unanswerable questions. I don't want to try to answer answerable questions. She's like, all right, well, you need to switch because life's too short for all that. So I, huge shout out to her. She has no idea how much she changed my life. So I dropped pre-med that day and I switched to become a psychology major and philosophy minor, and completely re-geared my life toward this just perpetual attempt to answer questions that can never really be answered.
It really resonates with me. I studied accounting and finance in college because to make my mom proud, who had hammered into me that if I wanted to be employable and independent and all of these things, that the only things you should study are finance and accounting because they are very hard skill oriented business things.
Right.
And I just remember going through accounting classes thinking, this has got to be one of the dumbest subjects in the history of humanity. We made up rules for adding numbers together to try and make sure people don't break the law, basically. And I just remember it being this like idiotic pursuit of a thing that seemed like it really didn't matter. And I did get a degree in it, which was a bit of like an exercise in just sustained self-discipline in the face of things I didn't want to do. But I can remember this teacher, and I have told her this, but it was a similar moment to your guidance counselor. And I think I had like a D in this class at about halfway through the semester. It was right before the drop date where you had to, if you were going to drop the class, you had to drop it without getting penalized or whatever. And I go into office hours and shout out to Dr. Jane Thayer, who I think is at Emory now. She basically just reamed me out, to say it like in a crude way. She said, you are totally underutilizing your potential. You are not taking this class seriously. You hardly ever show up on time. You clearly aren't studying. So I don't even know what you want me to say to you. I have nothing to say to you. My answer to you is, if you stay in this class, I don't think you're going to pass it. And if you drop it, then you need to change something about how you're approaching things before you come back into the class.
Wow.
And I was just like, okay, sounds good, Dr. Thayer. And she was probably about in kind of our age range now, like you and me now. And so she was still relatively, like young enough that I could relate to her, but old enough where she was like this authority figure and I really respected her. And it just felt like one of the first times someone ever said to me, not just, you really f***ed that up, but like, you have so much more potential than this. And it gave me just enough of a chip on my shoulder to say, well, now I'm definitely not dropping this class because I'm going to prove that I can do it. And I still ended up with a crappy grade because I was so far in the hole at that point. But every grade from that point on was like a high B or better. And it was just a matter of forcing myself to sit in the chair long enough to learn these things that felt like they were stupid.
Having just done my taxes, I have to say I agree with you that these arbitrary rules make no sense.
Oh, God. I really wish someone had the conversation, though, with me at the time that they had with you, which is like, there are other subjects, And now I look back and I think how interested I was in leadership development, organizational psychology, even like more creative fields, design and other things like architecture. And there was just no one around me who had the awareness of me to say, go do something else, dude. And so it's such a wonderful gift that someone was able to do that for you and say like, hey, just reorient right over here. And you might find something you really love. And you did, like all the way through getting a PhD from that point.
Yeah, I feel really grateful.
That's
sometimes
awesome.
wonder what the timeline looks like where I had kept trying to claw my way toward a thing I really didn't want.
Yeah. So internally for you, as you changed directions, did it feel like there was an engine that started turning that wasn't there before? Like, I guess, how did you go from making that change on that day to this long-term pursuit of not just studying the field, but going down the path of expertise in it?
Yeah. I mean, I have to also say that one of the things about ADHD I've come to accept about myself is the first chunk of time in a new thing, I'm never going to do super well because I need time to figure out the game. I'm better at figuring out how to game the game than I am at actually doing well at the thing. So that first semester of college probably would have gone poorly no matter what. But when I switched over to psychology and I started to figure out how to do well in school and all of that, something did really click in. And I had these incredible professors. I had one professor, shout out, his name is Dick Mann. Richard Mann. And he was part of the original Harvard LSD studies when he was a student at
Oh, cool.
Harvard.
Mhm.
You know, they gave him acid and he sat in a white room and they studied him while he talked about what was going on in his mind. And then he eventually became a psychologist, and he taught the coolest classes at Michigan where I went. He taught psychology of consciousness and spirituality, and his whole class was just read these books and let's talk about them. He didn't make us write papers or take tests. You really just had to show that you were willing to think. And it showed me how powerful it is to just use your mind to create new ideas and new worlds. So then from there, I guess I always knew I'd go to grad school. I think, despite being able to shed this sort of false self of becoming a physician, I don't know if I was able to fully get away from the idea that I still had to be a doctor of some kind. So I went to grad school right from college, which I don't recommend. I recommend taking some time to learn how to be an adult because I felt like I was still really a kid by the time I got into grad school. But I went to this incredible program. It's called the Wright Institute. It's in Berkeley. It's on Berkeley's campus. And it is one of the few, or at the time at least, it was one of the few programs that really honored a more classic type of psychology that believes that symptom relief is not the most important thing, that actually understanding why we are the way we are and cleaning out wounds in a long-term way is going to do more for someone than just teaching them some tools to try to change things in the immediate. So I got really wonderful training there. And then really, truly the most profound catalyst for all of it was that I got into my own really good therapy. I had this exceptional therapist who I started with my first year of grad school. And I didn't think I needed therapy. I've talked about this before. I thought I was so self-aware. I thought I was so evolved. I was just doing it because I wanted to sample this product I was learning to sell.
I just want to plug real quick at this moment in time. I want to plug your TED Talk because you got such wonderful, hilarious laughs from the audience at this point of the story in your TED Talk.
Thanks.
It was so funny.
Thank you for that. Yeah, that was a fun one. Yeah. So, she ended up just blowing my mind with how much I didn't know. All of these things that I thought about my life were just happening to me. I realized, oh no, I'm bringing these things into my life for various reasons. I'm repeating patterns. I'm seeking familiar dynamics, even though they're not serving me. And I think it's wild that not every therapist has ever even been in therapy, which is truly insane to me. But part of why it's so important is you gain faith in the process. My therapy is what taught me, oh, this shit works. It is worth being in, even when it doesn't feel like anything is happening at any given moment. So that therapy really changed everything. That was the thing that probably made me feel like, okay, yes, this is what I want to do. That being said, my ADHD mind was such that I was never going to be able to just see patients. It's only one thing, no way, So I've seen patients ever since I started grad school, and I continue to love that work, but I only see a very small caseload because I have to be doing all of these other things. So in grad school, I started doing workshops and talks for companies and public speaking. And I started ideating on this mental health startup that I co-founded. And I was writing, I was teaching in a master's program. And, I was doing 100 things. And that is really the best way my mind works.
It's very relatable to me. I can't just coach. I have to do the podcast and write a book and think about acquiring companies and like all of the other things that come with it. So I can definitely relate to that. What were some of and you don't have to answer this question because this is obviously personal, but do you have an example of the kind of patterns that you saw pop up in your own therapy that you've been able to not just treat the symptoms of, but that you've been able to get to that deeper layer and kind of repattern around?
Without maybe going into too much detail, I came to see all the ways that I was recreating in my romantic relationships and friendships the dynamics that I had with my siblings and my parents. Those things weren't always that good for me. Another big one was because I was this ADHD kid at this little school with all these well-behaved people and the teachers didn't like me. I really had this idea about myself that I wasn't a person who could learn and who could be liked by a regular large group of people, that kind of thing. And in therapy, I really examined, those were ways of thinking that made sense back at the time, but maybe didn't hold water anymore. And I could sort of look at a new body of evidence and reprogram these ideas that I had about myself. So that was really powerful. I'd say I mostly had a really charmed life. I'm very lucky, a lot of privilege, and my parents loved me, and I'm really lucky in a lot of ways. But I did exist amidst some complicated mental health stuff. And one of the things that created for me was the sense that things can change on you at any time, and that you have to be vigilant and you have to be ready for anything all the time. Yeah. And it turned me into this very sort of anxious, vigilant person. And therapy helped me realize and sort of have some self-compassion for the fact that at one point that was a helpful thing to be, but that perhaps now I didn't need to be quite so vigilant and quite so anxious all the time. And over time, I learned how to let some of that go. Yeah, some of it, mind you, really I'm still plenty anxious sometimes.
My experience is that these things you don't like rip them out of you, never to be seen again. They go in waves, and my ability to relate differently to my old patterns is much better. But in acute periods of stress or under certain trigger circumstances or whatever, they still come back up. It's not like they're just gone forever and I never have to experience them again. I have a similar one around hypervigilance. And what's interesting to me on the like being liked by a group of people thing is you seem to have been able to relate differently to it, but it is amazing to me in my world. So I mostly work with really successful creators. So people with large audiences online, and the degree to which narratives like groups of people will never fully allow me to fit in, which is something I can relate to, in the face of ample evidence otherwise, like millions of followers sometimes saying, I want to hear from you. Still, that underlying story can persist in the face of such different circumstances and facts. And this is such a powerful example to me of why the therapeutic work matters.
Right.
Because it does not matter what the external circumstances are. If you are still living as if the old thing exists, you won't experience the new version of it as it actually is.
Not only that, but you're unconsciously invested in maintaining that older experience of it, because that was the way you oriented yourself in the world. And one of the interesting things about therapy is that as you start to heal, you have a lot of grieving to do of all of this time in your life where healing wasn't an option. It might seem counterintuitive that some part of me wants to keep thinking of myself as someone who doesn't fit in. But if I fit in now, then does that mean I could have fit in all that time when I was young and I spent all that time like just in the wrong environment, and the people who should have seen that I wasn't fitting in weren't able to do that? And there's all of this really tough stuff that you have to then face and accept. And so often the way that we keep that from having to be is that we just convince ourselves, no, nothing has changed. Nothing can change. I'll just keep doing things the way I've always done them. So there really is a lot of grief, I think, that you have to do, or that you have to tolerate if you want to grow.
I've heard you talk about this before, kind of this saying of the fact that grief and growth are kind of indelibly tied.
Yeah.
I've talked about this also in terms of grief and joy are also tied. That in my experience of my life anyways, my ability to experience the fullness of joy has been in direct proportion to my willingness to also feel sadness and loss and grief.
For sure.
That like these two ends of the emotional spectrum are compatriots. They're related to one another.
Yeah.
And it's like my emotional spectrum was this big for a big period of my life. I'm holding my hands up close together for the audio listeners. And once I figured out how to grieve the loss of all these things, that can sound kind of weird when you haven't been through it, I guess. So stick with us, I guess, is what I'll say. But when I learned to grieve, the loss of all those situations that I wish I could have had and that aren't available to me now because I can't go back. We can only be right here, right? We can only be in the present moment together right now, you and me, Emily. And what can change though is every moment after this. Like if I carry a story that talented, successful people will never want to be my friend, for example, because someone bullied me in high school and they were popular, then what are all the opportunities I would continue to lose by, for example, not doing the show or not following up with people who come on the show and building a long-term relationship with them. Whereas addressing that and grieving that and processing it allows me a new experience. It allows me this chance to be like, oh, okay, so I can't get that back, but I can grieve that and really process it. And now, having grieved that, I can say, well, do I want to choose differently? Do I want to weave a new narrative for my life and my relationships? And it has just totally transformed my life to be able to see these things.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
It really is so powerful. Grief creates space. It clears out the things that are filling up space that you could instead be filling with things that are serving you better. And, it's hard to move on from something until you've honored the place that it has in your life. This book that I wrote that's coming out, the entire chapter on resilience is essentially about grief. I just don't think that we talk enough about how important that is. I don't think we're taught super well how to grieve. I don't know that we're given permission to grieve. And it's such an important process for mental health.
Yes. And not to harp on it too much, but I would say that is even more true. It is true across, especially American and Western society, but I think especially with men, that there's this blockage, especially men have, from processing sadness and grief. And I really strongly believe that if that is an experience you have had as any person, but especially as a man, because just that's the body I occupy, that there is no more powerful work you can do than learn to process that stuff.
For sure.
My probably most recommended book of the last 5 years is The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Francis Weller, I think. I don't know if you've ever read it, but
I haven't.
It's a wonderful book, relatively short read, but very powerful on the different, I think he talks about them in terms of gates of grief. So the different triggers for grief, and, death being one of them, but just one of them of 5 that he talks about. And death is basically the only topic that is popularly covered when it comes to grief.
Right.
And there are all of these other situations that trigger the same need for processing. And so there's this full, beautiful range there that, I just invite people to maybe explore. I think it's a wonderful field.
We have to grieve even things we've never had. Disappointment is essentially that feeling of not having something that you wanted to have or that you thought you would have. And grieving that thing is powerful and clears new space. So I really agree. Super important.
I had my last example here, and then we'll move on because I don't want to harp on it too much. But I had a recent session with a client, and we were talking about basically the process of detachment that has to happen as a child becomes an adult and then gets married, and when the epicenter of their relationship shifts from their parents to their partner, and kind of that attachment process, attachment, detachment, reattachment, and how mothers, as their children kind of launch into life, lose them. Essentially, they lose the attachment that the child feels towards the mother in the same way, and that is a massive source of loss. And how tender that is, and how that is just not acknowledged and talked. There is a process one has to go through when you say, I no longer get to be mom in the same way or dad in the same way.
Right.
And my kid's going to go do their thing now, and I have to learn a new way of being in relationship to them. And it's just another example where that's the opposite of death in many ways.
Right.
So it's just a beautiful topic to me, and I love it so much. To come back to your story, you went into kind of clinical practice and began receiving clients as part of your course of study.
Right.
But you also had this motivation to pursue other things. And eventually that led you to want to found a company. And so I'm curious how that all came about, how you found your co-founder and how Koa came to be.
Well, I at the time was working on sort of building a Twitter presence. And so I was challenging myself to tweet every single day. I told myself, I'm going to think of a complex psychological idea that I'm learning about, and I'm going to try to figure out how to explain it in 180 characters or less, or whatever the limit was at the time. And so I was starting to make some really cool connections on that platform. And then my co-founder, Alexa Meyer, messaged me on Twitter and said, I am thinking of this mental health startup idea, and I, respect your perspective and would love for just to take you to coffee and tell you about it. And at the time, I think she and I were almost ideating on similar things from different angles. I was already thinking about what it looks like to speak about mental health in a more proactive way. And she was thinking about what it would look like to have a sort of therapy clinic or gym. Like, how can we have therapy be more in the public eye? Her story is that she'd be walking around San Francisco and she would see One Medical and she would see Equinox and she would see all of these things that said, your physical health is important. We provide a space for you to pay attention to it. And there wasn't any equivalent for mental health. And I was doing all of this research on what a more proactive approach to mental health actually looks like. And we kind of found each other at just the right time. So we went to coffee and I loved what she was doing. And I said, I would love to help you. If we're going to do this, let's do it the right way. Mental health companies were just starting to kind of be a thing. And it felt like I was already seeing all of the shortcuts that they were taking that was really pissing me off, because therapy is so much about the integrity of the work that when you compromise that, you just might as well not do it at all. You're going to do more harm than good. And so I feel really grateful that Alexa was on board with, let's do this with a lot of integrity. Let's keep the relationship between therapist and patient central in everything that we do. And so our idea was to create this therapy gym, a space in San Francisco to start, where people could come and see their therapist, but then also, have a snack and meet other people who also believe in therapy and just create kind of community and everything. And we got so far as to architect out this beautiful space in San Francisco. It was so cool. We were so excited and ready. And then COVID hit. So in person was just not going to be a thing. So we did a quick pivot and we took all of the research that I had done on this more proactive approach to mental health, and we created these classes that help people train their mental and emotional health in a proactive way. All of our classes would be taught by licensed therapists, and we would support individuals and companies essentially to strengthen things like self-awareness and resilience and communication and empathy, things like that. And it took off from there, and it's been really cool. We've worked with all kinds of incredible companies, from Salesforce to, smaller startups to the NBA. One of our investors is Kevin Love, and he's been this incredible champion of things. So that has all been amazing, and also was a platform for me to start really thinking about writing this book about these 7 traits of emotional fitness, which is what I call them. And it's been cool to see the effect it's had for people.
This is not true across the board, because obviously some therapists and medical providers exist within systems where they're truly just an employee and they get their schedule and they go do their schedule. But I do think a lot of therapists are, especially those operating independently, they're entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
That may not be their primary identity, but they are in fact having to generate demand and serve clients. And I want to acknowledge that like, it's not that you weren't an entrepreneur, but being a founder of a thing that's going to be bigger than your practice is a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I wonder how you had to transform in making that shift towards, I'm now a founder of an organization that's bigger than me.
For sure. I mean, I had worked with so many founders. I had all of these sort of ideas about the psychological threads that run through founders. And really the biggest thing that happened is I realized how much harder it is to do the things I was telling founders they should do. Like prioritize rest and, build without burnout and all these things. And then I'm a founder and it's like, oh shit, well, I really probably should just work all night to get this done. And, I had to really learn how to practice what I had been preaching essentially. So that was a big thing. And then there's just all these realities of trying to make something work in the world of capitalism that wasn't really designed to be about that. What makes therapy so powerful is not how quickly it makes the therapist money. It's the depth of the relationship between these two people and the way that relationship comes to represent all of the other relationships in the patient or client's life. And so it was a whole lot of me always trying to hold both of these things. I want to create a company that succeeds. I want our stakeholders to benefit from believing in us. And I really don't want to drop what I know makes this work magical and powerful. So that was always an interesting kind of dance.
Yeah. There's this like sacred nature to the relationship that doesn't necessarily cater to a VC's feedback on how fast can you scale.
100%. Yes.
I can just imagine all the VC feedback of like, so what if you just remove the people constraint here?
Should we just have an AI chatbot here? Yeah.
I can only imagine the number of times you've had to deal with that. So this raises a topic that I've become really passionate about. And I've seen an interesting swing in two directions. One was, and I think you said this on on the Prof G show, that in COVID, very rapidly, demand for mental health services went up like 900% almost overnight. And I've seen this interesting swing back now, especially in the kind of like Silicon Valley entrepreneurial world. It seems to have mirrored a little bit of the swing to the right in some of the Silicon Valley world politically, which I'm not saying that pejoratively. I'm just saying I've observed that those things seem to have been timed about the same, where there's like this backlash against therapy in some cases. You know, books like Bad Therapy and other things like this, almost creating a wedge and by saying, well, look at all the downsides of therapy. And I, of course, am not good at driving wedges because I like nuance. And I think that the world is not black and white. It's very, very, very gray. And I think that there is good therapy and there's bad therapy and there's everything in between.
Right.
And I'm curious what you think the qualities of really high quality, high integrity therapy are.
Good question. Yeah, I think a lot of the problems with therapy, gosh, there's plenty of them. Believe me, I'm not one to say that all therapy is good therapy by any stretch. And there's so many things around getting therapy that are a complete shit show right now. You know, it's not covered by insurance most of the time, and it's really not affordable and doable for a lot of people. And there's a shortage of therapists, and there's all kinds of problems there. But what I think makes really quality therapy is how high quality the relationship is between the therapist and the patient or client. Because ultimately, that is what it is all about. Something I say often is most people don't go to therapy because they don't know what to do. Most people go to therapy because they do know what to do, but need help understanding why they're not doing it. And to get out of our own way, we almost have to create this world with our therapist where we can play out the things that are happening in the rest of our life. So good therapy is a place where you feel supported and seen and held and where you trust your therapist, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a place that feels good all the time or that you look forward to going to. You're not always going to feel better when you leave than you did when you came in. It's often really hard and painful because life is hard and painful, and that's why you're there, is to understand that. Do you trust overall that this person has your back to help you move toward the kind of life that you want to live? And one of the litmus tests I give people when they're trying to decide, is this the right therapist for me, is can you tell your therapist that you're mad at them, that they disappointed you, that you didn't like something they said, that you didn't feel good after the last session? Can you tell them that? And can they meet you there and talk about it with you, not be too apologetic or too defensive, not crumble under the weight of it? Can they say, I'm so glad that you told me that. Let's think about what happened there. Because I guarantee you at some point, you're going to be upset with your therapist for similar reasons that you were upset with other people in your life. And if you can explore that with them, then that's when the real work begins. So go to your therapist and say, I'm mad at you, and see how the conversation goes. And if it goes to somewhere generative and you feel like you are able to understand something through it, that's really good therapy.
Yeah. One of my litmus tests in my own relationship with my therapist is how often do I leave feeling justified for the way I'm already behaving versus how often do I feel challenged to continue to grow and adapt? And it's not like if I ever feel justified, therefore it's bad therapy for me. That's not, I don't want to make that the case either, because sometimes I really do need the litmus test of like, oh, maybe I did handle that pretty well. Right. You know, that's actually really helpful to me on occasion. But it's a little bit of a red flag to me if the primary thing I walk away from my therapist's office on a consistent basis with is, yep, I feel like I'm doing everything pretty much right.
For sure.
You know, right being a pretty judgmental reflection of my own inner world, but you get the point there. And what I have seen that has become my kind of like test for, is this therapeutic relationship serving me still, is, am I continuing to see an uncovering of the root of things, of how I behave in the world? And am I continuing to make conscious choice about how I want to adapt or change that to better serve my current reality? And that is why I've been in the current therapeutic relationship I'm in for a long time, years now, because I just see this continual and gradual process of experiencing a better version of my life. And I think ideally that would be the output of therapy from my standpoint for people when they go into a relationship, is having a objectively and subjectively better experience of their own life.
That's awesome. I mean, it's complicated because the things that therapy will do for you don't always feel super quantitative. They're more qualitative a lot of the time. And it doesn't always feel like they're happening in the moment. That's why I was saying that being in my own therapy gave me a lot, because when I'm sitting with a patient, neither of us feels like anything is happening. I still trust the greater process that something is happening. There's a Woody Allen quote. Can't say I'm a huge supporter of Woody Allen, but he said, therapy is like piano lessons. For years, it feels like nothing's happening, and then suddenly you're a musician. And that's often how it would be in therapy. There'd be weeks that I was like, what even was that? But then 5 years into it, my entire life had changed. Everything about my life was better and healthier because of the work that I'd done. So it's hard because you don't want to stay in bad therapy for too long waiting to find out if it's going to be good. But you do also have to have a little faith in the long game if you want to make real change. Like, it took me X number of years to be the person I am. It's going to take a while to change it. We have to honor how complicated our lives are, and that it's going to take a little while to sort of detangle the threads and then put them back together in a better way.
Yeah. Yeah. Concrete kind of like metaphor here is if you tear an ACL, it doesn't just heal. It takes 6 months or a year of physical therapy and going and having consistent practice and re-strengthening. And it's not the same, but you wouldn't expect a torn ACL to heal overnight is the point there.
Totally.
And it's a very similar thing with old wounds and patterns and all of the stuff that we carry with us, even when it wasn't from like a big T traumatic event.
Right.
We all get shaped by the forces around us. It's just the reality.
For sure.
And we hit points in life, gates in life, when that stuff stops serving us in the same way.
100%.
So, okay, we're preaching the choir now. My last question here in this first half of the conversation is, you've got this book coming out.
Yes.
And through my lens of looking at your work, I mean, this book's been in the works for 15 years.
Yeah, in some ways, for sure.
And I wonder when you knew it was time to put it on the page, because it's like a demarcation. It's like, okay, my findings on this topic are going to be complete on some level to the degree that I'm comfortable putting them in front of people. And I'm wondering when you knew it was good enough to put it on paper in this way.
Oh man, I don't know if it ever really feels good enough. I feel that's kind of the plight of the, creator. So I had done this big research project on these 7 traits. I did something called an interpretive phenomenological analysis, which is a fancy way of saying I interviewed 100 psychologists and entrepreneurs about what an emotionally healthy leader looks like and what it feels like to be with them. And so I had done this research, I had sort of synthesized all this data, and I had started teaching workshops about these 7 traits, as I call them. And I wrote articles about them and saw that was being received well. And then I had a book agent attend a talk that I did about the 7 traits. And afterwards he said, this really should be a book. Let's make this happen. And I said, oh yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, maybe. But I was just starting COA at the time. And I threw my focus totally into COA. And I think that ended up being a really good thing because I got to test these 7 traits on all of these incredible leaders from these, amazing companies. And so then a few years into working on COA, what we started to notice is that this term emotional fitness, which I had, been using to describe this proactive approach to mental health, it was starting to be taken up by, it was starting to find its way into the zeitgeist. And I think at some point my co-founder was just like, you need to write this book, don't you think it's important that you attach your name to all of this? And so I went back to my agent and said, okay, let's do it, and cranked out a proposal and locked in the publishing deal. And then it was just honestly a total shit show. Like, writing a book is so hard. It really is complicated to try to be creative on demand and to try to put all of these different thoughts into words that can be taken up by people. I really wanted to put clinical examples into the book, and I wanted to be really thoughtful about how I did that. And so it was just kind of nonstop work. And then the truth is, I don't know that when I turned it in, I was like, it's finally ready. I was like, oh shit, it's my deadline yesterday. This book is going to happen. And that's kind of how it goes, and I've had to make peace with the idea that you can't be forever working on something. Sometimes you have to just put it out there. And I feel really excited about it. I'm looking forward to seeing how it lands.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. I got a little preview of it, and The writing's great. The stories are powerful. The exercises are helpful. So I legitimately believe that every person listening to this show, which is about entrepreneurship, being successful at it, being long-term sustainable, how you handle the psychology of success after you've made it, quote unquote.
Yeah.
It's just like tailor-made for every person who listens to this show. So let me just say that.
I'm so
now.
glad.
Yeah.
That means a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So I think that kind of brings us up to the present day and the story of Emily. And we're going to pause here for a moment. When we come back, we're going to talk about the psychology of success.
Fantastic.
And what it looks like to handle all of the rewards, feedback cycles, and everything that comes with getting to the point that you once dreamed of and how things change afterwards. So that's what people can look forward to.
Can't wait.
Today, I'm excited to introduce you to our first ever sponsor on good work, Proper. If you're building something with purpose, then you know the struggle. You need support, probably more than you think you can afford, but hiring is slow, expensive, and risky. Proper fixes that with an onboarding process that makes it simple to get started and pairs you with a vetted executive assistant who's ready to work immediately. You can start small with fractional support and then scale as your business grows. The result is a true partner who can take things off your plate before they pile up, maybe before you even know you need help, so you can stay focused on the work that only you can do. Proper isn't just another service. It's the unlock for sustainable growth without the burnout. Get started today at workwithproper.com. Make sure to mention the Good Work podcast and your onboarding fee will be completely waived. That's a $500 value. Schedule your free discovery call today at workwithproper.com and make sure to mention Good Work. All right, let's get back to the show. Hey, it's Barrett. You've reached about the midpoint of this conversation, and while we take a little break for station identification, as they say, I want to tell you about two things. First of all, I write a newsletter every Saturday for founders and creators who are leading teams and companies to make an impact through your work. It has 3 sections in it. The first one is a mini essay from me based on my executive coaching work with founders and creators about how to lead well. It has 3 long-form essays or links from around the web that will help spark new thoughts to help you lead better. And it has 1 quote from a meaningful book that I often find myself recommending to friends and clients. All the feedback I've gotten so far is that it hits exactly on the kinds of issues that founders, CEOs, and creators are facing every day in their work. So if that sounds appealing to you, make sure to go to my website at barrettbrooks.com and you can subscribe right at the top of the homepage. That's BARRETTBROOKS.com. The second thing I want to tell you about is that my day job, I actually do have a day job, I'm not just a podcaster yet, is as an executive coach, as I just mentioned. I work with founders of Series A startups and later, and with creators who are doing at least $1 million as a solo founder and are now thinking about growing a team. The uniting commonality between the founders and the creators I work with is that you've reached a point in your business where you know you're going to make it. Actually, you're doing quite well. And now the question is, how much do you want to scale? And what are the leadership challenges that you're going to face along the way? This work is based on both my training as a coach and in my work as an operator and growing my old company ConvertKit from $3 to $30 million in annual revenue. If you're a founder or creator who might benefit from coaching, or if you know someone who's looking for a coach, I'd love for you to check out my site and my coaching page at barrettbrooks.com/coaching. You can learn everything about how I work as a coach and also fill out a form to have an exploratory conversation if that sounds interesting to you. All right, that's all I got for you right now. Let's get back to the conversation for the second half. So I mentioned before we took a break that I want to talk about the psychology of success. And so often, especially in my world, the kind of creator world, but in Silicon Valley too, so much of the kind of legendarium of the space of entrepreneurship is making it. How do you get to the point of making it? And my observation has been that making it changes basically nothing about the underlying psychological experience of your life.
Yeah.
It changes your operating reality. It can change your financial reality. It can change resources you have available. But generally speaking, they are not one and the same. Like your emotional growth and your financial or business success, they have a very strong relationship, but one does not lead to the other necessarily. I would say emotional health might lead to business success, but I don't think the other way works the same way.
Right. And if anything, success can often cause problems and be harder on people psychologically than they realize.
Yes. And I think this is a surprise to most people.
Yeah.
And I think this is primarily why I have a job. So that's good. I think it's a lot of what people probably come to you for from a different angle. And in my ideal world, every one of my clients has a separate but coexisting therapeutic relationship that they can then bring findings from back to the business coaching side of things. And there's this relationship between the two, because the other observation I have is that everything you have going on internally is showing up at work somehow.
For sure. Who you are anywhere is who you are everywhere.
And it is not invisible to your team, to your customer base. It's like sometimes other people can see it even more clearly than you can, often because they're subject to it. Okay, so that's kind of teeing up this part of the conversation. And I thought we might go through some of the challenges of success that I see in my client base. And I wondered if we might talk a little bit about kind of the roots of those things, what you've seen commonly about where these things come from, and maybe how someone might repattern around them if they're going through that right now. Does that sound like an okay framework here?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So one thing I see sometimes or often, people will come to me and they say, I've been stuck at this revenue number for 4 years. Could be 500,000, could be 1.3 million, could be millions and millions, but they plateau at some point. And there is clearly no objective reason why that has to be the case. There's not a limited customer base. It's not a broken business model. There's something else going on beneath the surface here. And revenue is just an easy embodiment of this idea of getting stuck in a place. And I wonder what you've seen are some common patterns that lead someone to get stuck at kind of an upper limit, as it's sometimes referred to, and why it's so hard for people to break through some of those limits.
So I'm sure there's an infinite number of reasons why this might happen. But one of the things that comes to mind and that I've seen more often than people might imagine is that we are as scared or more scared of success as we are of failure. Succeeding can actually be really, really terrifying and really shift a lot about your life and about your sense of self and what your life looks like and all of that. And so I would wonder in that case if there is something emotionally that feels, I don't know, terrifying about what it would look like to move past that stuckness or past that number. Is that something you've seen?
I think so. One of the things I observed that relates back to something you said earlier is that I think often it would force the person, the entrepreneur, to embrace a new truth about themselves that they may not be ready for. So if they're living in a story that's something like, chip on the shoulder, I've always been an underdog, people don't believe in me, I've always had to do more with less, like there's a lot of versions of it. And going from $300,000 in revenue to $1 million would now require them to say, well, I'm not an underdog. In fact, people do like what I do. I have very popular attention available to me. And I'm basically unlimited in how much money I can earn now for my family. Like that's a big shift.
It is a big shift. And it's also scary to get it if you're not sure you can keep it. So what happens if I do succeed, but then I will be failing from a higher platform if things don't work out? And that's also very scary.
Yeah. So like, what if I get what I say I want and then I screw it all up?
For sure.
What will that mean about me? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's really good. So another one I see here is Mark Manson, who wrote a book called The Subtle Art of Not Giving a F***. And I interviewed him on stage at ConvertKit's conference. So I was the COO of ConvertKit for a number of years. It's now called Kit. And at our conference, I interviewed Mark, and it was right after his second book had come out. And the primary kind of thrust of that interview was about this deep depressive state he went into after his first book had massive success.
Right.
Like best-selling book of the prior decade or something like that.
Right.
And the way he framed it was that he had achieved every single goal he had for himself when he was younger at the age of whatever he was, 35 or something. And that this sent him into a tailspin.
Yeah.
And I see this pretty commonly as well. And I wonder what that looks like internally, like what you've seen leads to that reaction to success.
So I think of the quote that Jim Carrey, the actor, said, which is, I wish everyone could be rich and famous and have everything they ever wanted so that they can see that it's not the answer. I think something that often happens is that people have all these ideas that when they achieve every goal that they've ever had for themselves, that they will then be happy, content, at peace, that all of a sudden everything else in their life will fall into place, that they'll feel good. And when that doesn't happen, then it's like, oh shit, well, now what? There's nothing to strive for. I can't put this idea in something that I can actionably move toward. For someone who's really good at working hard and using their mind, saying, oh, if I just do X, Y, and Z, everything will work out, is comforting because you're confident in your ability to do X, Y, and Z. But if you realize, no, there's nothing I can maybe like conquer to have everything I need. Maybe I actually have to sit with myself. Maybe I actually have to process things or reevaluate what it is I actually want in life. I mean, it's a really big ask and can be a real identity mind. I remember I interviewed Alex Lieberman, who started Morning Brew. I interviewed him.
Huge newsletter.
Yeah, right. And I mean, he sold it for something like $76 million or something like that. He was overnight extraordinarily wealthy. Interviewed him about it, and he said, the year after I made all of that money was the most depressed I've ever been. Because all of a sudden, this thing I'd wanted for so long happened, and I didn't feel happy, and I didn't feel at peace, and now I didn't know what I should be working toward, and now everything I did seemed less meaningful, and I didn't know what the point was of it all. So that's the thing, is we put so much stock in the destination, and as cliche as it sounds, we forget that life is not waiting for you at the destination. Life is the journey to get there. And if you are not investing in right now feeling the way you want it to, you're going to feel really disappointed when you get to where you think it's all waiting for you.
Yeah. This is obviously not at all clinical in nature because I don't have that kind of training. But the way I describe it with people that I work with and in workshops I give is when you lose the entire organizing force for, at minimum, your working life, but maybe your life, it's very disorienting.
Totally.
You go from someday I will whatever to, okay, here I am. I didn't have plans beyond that.
Yeah. For
and
sure.
I just think it's this disorienting thing. And it's extraordinarily rare. I think it's much more rare for people to be like, all right, I'm good. Let's keep rolling and just be good with it than it is for people to really suffer at that point. So let's imagine someone's listening and they're kind of at this point, and it feels absurd to say this out loud to most people in your life. So like in Mark's case, and I only reference him because we did it in public. It's on YouTube. And so I've seen lots of other examples of it. But, he had sold however many millions of copies. And even if he only made $1 a book, which most of the time isn't the case,
right,
he had millions and millions of dollars.
Right.
He had a massive audience, all the interview requests and all the attention he could want. So all the resource constraints were gone, essentially, for all intents and purposes. From that point, what can someone do to start to build back to some new organizing force for their life?
I wish there was a perfect answer for that, but I think it probably has to do with making some space to have sort of a renaissance of your identity and what it is that you're orienting yourself toward. Like, what's important to you now? If getting enough resources was important to you before and now you have them, what is important to you to do with those resources? What is the compass you want to point your life with? And I think how people do this will look different. I think therapy is probably a great place to start, so you can think through that, understanding what your values are and if the choices you're making are aligning with those values, that kind of thing. I think another complicated thing happens is when you become very successful, all of your relationships suddenly feel sort of fraught. Alex talked about this, where it's like any new person that comes into your life, is it because you like me, or is it because I am successful and there are all these things I can do for you? And it tends to make things complicated in ways people don't realize. So probably a whole lot of introspection and exploration of what matters to you once the resource constraints are gone, and how to set up some structure in your life so that you don't feel like you're just floating along toward no real destination.
I don't remember which podcast it was, but you said something to the effect of the inherent challenge of being human is that we are meaning-making machines in a universe that is essentially meaningless.
Right.
And I wonder to what extent these things are related.
Yeah, right. That when you're grinding toward all of this, there's this sense of purpose and meaning. And then when you have it, you realize maybe it doesn't fulfill all of the meaning that you thought that it would.
Yeah, something in there. They seem related to me that you really have to stare at the void a little bit
For sure. I really
when
agree with
all
that.
of that, yeah, when all of that organization goes away.
Yeah.
This is going to sound maybe weird for people who haven't been there, but I wonder to what extent grief matters here, to go
Mm.
back to that part
Oh,
of the conversation.
that's huge, right? Like you're grieving this whole life you've been living up till now. You know, I had a client, I talk about this in the book, who was part of this little scrappy startup and he was absolutely loving his life, doing all these different things and making all this change. And they dreamed every day about having a big acquisition. And then the big acquisition happened and he got thrust into this big company where he was siloed and didn't see his colleagues very much anymore. And life wasn't as fun. And the very thing he'd been grinding toward now became the thing that made him feel less happy about his day to day life. And so he really had a lot of grieving to do of that life he was living before and all of the things that he lost in order to gain the success. I think that's a big part of it. But when I work with entrepreneurs, I think one of the things that distinguishes me as a therapist coach is I try to make it really clear that my goal is not to make you or your company as successful as possible. My goal is to help you live as authentic of a life as possible. And what you might find as you explore your inner world is that your ideas of success are going to change and your thoughts about what you want most in life might look different than what you originally imagined. And that requires some grieving too, because now you have to reorient yourself. And it is amazing how often someone, when they really get in touch with themselves, realize the whole reason I'm an entrepreneur in the first place isn't really aligned with who I am. You know, all of this has just been a chip on my shoulder or trying to make my parents proud, like the path I was on. And, you know, so there's something precarious about really knowing the truth about yourself.
There's a really important line between coaching and therapy that I work very hard to be clear about with my clients. And I don't go digging into the past because that's not what I'm trained for, really more future oriented, but the past really matters in these situations. And something I've noticed in the middle of a long arc of change with clients, and usually it's complemented by them exploring their past in therapy, is there can be a little bit of a dark period in the middle as they're going through it,
Oh, yeah.
where it's like they've uncovered all of these realities about themselves. They're seeing themselves more clearly, to your point, like, oh my God, I think I was embracing this thing. I can't fill this hole that way. Like I can't fill this hole in at this soul level with this thing I thought that I could. And now I see that. And now it's a similar thing to achieving the success and then getting there, but it's from a different place. It seems to be a pretty standard part of the change process where people have to kind of like go a little bit down into a dark hole of acknowledgement before they can build back. I wonder if you see that in your practice too.
Oh, for sure. Things often feel worse before they feel better. And the metaphor I use is imagine if you're sort of in this room that's full of all these boxes that have kind of been haphazardly packed in all of these ways, and you can't always find what you're looking for, and they're in your way. And you're like, you know what? I'm going to clean this all up. And so to clean it up, you probably have to take a whole bunch of stuff out of the boxes. And before you know it, you're just in this sea of stuff that you don't know what to do with. And it's going to take some time to organize it and figure out where it should go and which things you want to get rid of and which things you want to keep. And, you know, that messy middle part can be so disorienting. Now think about if all those things aren't things, but trauma and, you know, the stuff you've worked so hard to keep in those boxes. It can be really discombobulating. But if you're willing to stick through that, if you can weather that, then on the other side is this beautiful new way of organizing your life that will allow you to get to places you wouldn't have been able to otherwise.
It strikes me as you're saying that it's kind of a dangerous point in the process, I think. I would imagine that's one of the places in the process, even reflecting on my own experience, that it would have been easy to really get lost there. I guess your options are kind of like freak out, put everything back in the boxes and like run away.
Right.
Leave it all over the floor and kind of like sit in it or abandon it or kind of like disassociate from it or reorganize it all.
Right.
And I wonder if you ever see people kind of like abandon things right in the middle there. That kind of freaks me out even as I'm talking about
it. For sure. I think that is a common time for a patient or a client, whichever word you like to use, to say, you know, this isn't really working. You know, I feel worse than I did before. And I think it is my job to say, I completely understand that it feels that way. Let me help you understand why that might be. And, there's this big leap of faith you have to take, that there is something possible if you'll stick with it, and that you are letting yourself know things that you didn't let yourself know before. And that, that there is a generative process here if you'll stay with it. So that part is really complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah, but worth doing.
That big sigh of the knowing memory of all the cases. Yeah. One of the things I also notice in people, so coming back to kind of this framework of like situations I see in successful people, is an increasing level of isolation, which you kind of mentioned earlier. There's like this pulling away from maybe existing relationships, but maybe also from like new ones, from new connection, from community-based support. And, even in the metaphorical, like the bigger your house, the more fences you have around it, the more distance between you and your neighbors kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it seems true to me that when you have achieved a high level of anything, money, recognition, expertise, that my observation is really you actually need even more support.
Right.
Like your world gets really complex, and staying grounded in who you are and what you value and all of these things is very difficult from that place of, it's not infinite resource, but sometimes it can feel that way, whether it's reach or money or reputation or whatever. I wonder, what do you think underlies that kind of like isolation tendency, and what's the path to kind of building almost like a community of achievement or a community of trust with other people who get it?
There's so many layers here. I mean, there's just the fact that it's lonely at the top, right? Like I think about, if you're used to working on a team and in a company, there's all of these ways that you get to commiserate and support each other. You get to shout each other out at meetings. Someone's going to talk about how well you did. You get to talk shit about your boss together. You get to do all these things that make you feel like you're really in it with people. But when you're the boss, when you're the leader, it's not people's job to shout you out anymore that it's a child's job to tell the parent that they're doing a good job, And so you're not getting that same recognition, and you're not going to be talking shit with other people at the company, because that's certainly not the role that you should be playing. So suddenly you're sort of out there on your own. And then on top of that, there's exactly what you said, which is that when people succeed, they can start to feel really lonely for a few reasons. One of them is, I do think that then people in their life might feel envy. All the people in their life who might have been cheering them on might not feel as excited to be constantly cheering them on, because now they feel like, oh, you have everything. Like, why should I be supporting you all the time? That kind of thing. And then there's an even deeper aspect of like survivor guilt. For those who aren't familiar with this term, it's the guilt we feel when we're thriving in ways that people we care about aren't thriving. So I've worked with a lot of people who reach success and feel immense guilt because their parents never reached that level of success. Or, I worked with someone who got a promotion the same day that her spouse got fired. And so she felt like, how much can I really celebrate myself right now? I feel bad. I'm just going to downplay it. And there are all these ways, I think, that we can feel really lonely and separate, even as things feel like they're going super well. So to your point, I think building community before you get to the success part is really important. So you kind of know who your people are and who are in your corner. And then I think that building community of people who get it is really important. So other leaders who are in the same place that you are, other people who've experienced the same things you do. Psychologically, there are very few things as comforting as being with someone who really knows exactly what you're going through and feeling. This is why support groups are so important. So find who those people are and invest in them, support them, plant seeds, put as much into those relationships as you could ever hope to get out of them. And, hopefully they'll catch you when you need it the most. Yeah.
I'm really passionate about this topic. I think it's under talked about because it's not, population wide. It's not very common. Obviously there's like a normal distribution to levels of success people experience, but it is a very underserved population in a lot of ways because it's not particularly socially acceptable to talk about some of this stuff.
Right. And for good reason, right? Like there's only so much people want to hear someone say, woe is me, I'm so successful.
Yeah.
One of the things I talk about a lot is depression is made of the same chemicals across all people. sadness, joy, all these feelings, no matter who you are, it's the same chemicals running through your body. And so even if society would say that you're less justified for feeling a certain way, that doesn't mean that it doesn't feel the same inside of you. And so
Yeah.
I don't think it's everyone's job to be supporting the successful people all the time, but I do think those successful people need support and should find the avenues to get it because, like you said, it can be very lonely and problematic otherwise.
Yeah. It's like you don't go to your team and say, after those layoffs yesterday, I went home and cried to my spouse because it was really hard on me. Your team doesn't care. They're going through their own experience watching all their friends get laid off. And it's not to say that you can't be vulnerable. I strongly believe in vulnerability as a leader, but there's just certain things that need to be communicated at the peer level versus, I don't want to say like down the org chart because that's not a proper view of society in my mind, but you kind of get what I'm saying there in terms of just where the weight can be carried appropriately.
You know what it makes me think of is I'm trying to find who originally said it because it's really worth giving this person credit. Okay, the circle of grief. Have you heard of this idea of the circle of grief?
No.
It's based on the ring theory, which it looks like is the brainchild of Susan Silk and her husband, Barry Goldman. Okay. But the basic idea is that in a moment of grief, let's say someone is facing an impending loss of a loved one, you should grieve out and support in. Meaning the person who's most close to that person who is going to pass away, that person, all the support should be going in toward there. And that person can grieve out to whoever they want. But let's say you're a couple layers out, it's a friend of a friend, but it's still affecting you. It's still hard for you. You're not going to seek support from the person who's about to lose their dearest loved one. You're going to support that person, but you still might need support. So you would go out to bigger rings of the circle and get support from someone who's a step farther away. So I think that there might be some comparison to be made here where you probably shouldn't be seeking support from people who have not yet achieved the success. You should probably be seeking it from people who've achieved the same amount or more success as you. And you should be supporting you should be supporting the people who are coming up toward where you are.
Yeah, that's really powerful. It's in my kind of audience, it would be support in towards your audience, towards people paying attention to you, looking up to you, and grieve out to peer level people, masterminds, groups that you're in as part of coaching or whatever. Oh, I like that.
Exactly.
That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
Okay. So one more I wanted to touch on here is overwork and burnout. And you touched on this a little bit in your own experience as well, that it's like so easy to see it in others and it's so hard not to get sucked into that. And I do view overwork and burnout as sometimes related, but separate topics, actually. My experience with burnout being that many times it's often more emotional than it is about number of hours I'm spending. Whereas overwork is like, I'm truly exhausted by the number of hours I'm working. And maybe that's just like a little nuanced thing that doesn't matter that much. But I'm curious how you see people work themselves into these situations and like what's going on there. And then what you see as the process of coming back out.
Oh man, this is just such a big thing because it's pretty hard to succeed if you're not working extraordinarily hard. And so there's an element of it that's somewhat inevitable. There's the fact that you don't really know where the line is till you've crossed it, for example. There's the psychological idea that some people feel like they're only worthy or successful if they are working themselves to the absolute extreme, and that if they were to ever work a reasonable amount, that they would no longer be worthy of whatever it is that they're achieving. There's that aspect. There are some people who equate sacrifice with success. And if they're not sacrificing themselves, they don't feel like they're actually doing anything.
Martyr syndrome.
That's a really important one. Totally. There's all of that. And then there's also just as you get into these bigger and, greater things, you don't always know how to modulate yourself. It's like when you become an athlete, the more intensive training you're going through, you have to learn the signals of your body better. You need to learn at what point to stop and rest and all of that. So it's so complicated and there's so much to it. But what I find is that on the whole, people almost always wait until they've completely run out of gas and are on the side of the road to decide to do anything about it. And that's the metaphor I use because once you're on the side of the road with no gas, it's really hard to refuel. You have to call AAA. You have to walk a mile to the gas station. You have to figure out all this shit. Whereas if you had just a couple miles back said, ooh, I'm nearing being out of gas, I'm going to go do something about this, your life would be so much easier. And we forget that as entrepreneurs, that you should not wait until you're running on fumes to do something. I worked with this incredible VC. He ran Harrison Metal, which I don't think is a VC anymore, but he was amazing, Michael Deering. And his quote that I always loved was, there's plenty of money in Silicon Valley and there's more than enough talent. What actually is the runway that people run out of is the emotional capacity to handle the grinding of the gears of startup life. And you are more likely to run out of energy way before you run out of money or talent. And I've personally seen this where I'll work with founders who are so tired that they will start unconsciously sabotaging things because they don't feel like they can quit, but they need to stop. And it feels like the only way to do that is to like fail out in a way.
Yeah.
And so you are investing in your success by taking care of yourself proactively. You are playing the long game. You know, if you're an athlete, you cannot push yourself to injury all the time, or you're not going to be able to play for very long. Similarly, you as an entrepreneur are running the equivalent of an emotional marathon every day, and you better be investing in the long game or you're really going to burn out in a fiery mess.
Yeah. It does seem like this has become a much more popular talk track and something that's more appreciated amongst the entrepreneurial kind of crowd and the VC crowd even. I agree with you. It does, for some reason, seem more respectable to say my startup failed rather than this way of working is not working for me anymore.
Totally. Or
That
I
is
need to slow
absurd.
down a little bit. I need our progress to be a little slower for a while so that I can catch up. Right.
Right. But
Yeah.
there's, LeBron James, one of the greatest athletes in the history of athletics, will tell you after a game, he sleeps 10 hours a night.
Totally.
And there's a reason for that. And, he's using his body physically in a different way, but you're using your brain hard every day. And it takes serious recovery time for your brain just to literally clean itself, for example.
When entrepreneurs say stuff like, yeah, sure, I'd love therapy, but I'm too busy for therapy. It's like, to me, that's like an athlete saying, I'm too busy to eat healthy. I'm just going to grab fast food. It's like, how are you going to fuel? How are you going to get the gold eating burgers and fries? That's just not how this works. Like, how are you going to keep doing this if you don't feel like you have the resources and support to keep going?
And you see this consistently in athletes who sustain long careers. Tony Gonzalez, LeBron James, Derek Jeter, Abby Wambach, like all the people who make it to 40, Tom Brady, they treat their bodies like it is their most important asset.
Yes.
And that is true for entrepreneurs. I really firmly believe that if you are a founder trying to do something important in the world, you are basically the equivalent of a pro athlete of entrepreneurship or business.
100%. 100%. And something my co-founder Alexa says is burnout is the workplace injury of the 21st century. If your job used your body and you weren't taking care of your body, you were going to be screwed. Well, guess what? Your job is all about your mind. And so you better be taking care of your mind or you're just not going to be able to keep going.
Yes. So I have 3 common questions I ask at the end of every interview, but I have one more topic I wanted to touch on with you. Well, I had lots of topics I wanted to that we're not going to get to. So there's that. Now I'm going to have to choose between them.
What are they?
So the 2 topics are, this is a bucket of the difference between cognition, emotion, and somatic experience.
Okay.
And then the other one is processing anger and rage.
Ooh.
Does one appeal to you more?
Maybe anger and rage.
Okay, so let me just own that the Enneagram is not a science-backed system for understanding personality, and I know this, and it's been a useful tool for me at times. I don't swear by it. It's like a tool in the toolkit. It helped me build awareness of like early childhood patterns before I had a lot of the tools I have now. So in the whole Enneagram thing, I'm an Enneagram 1, which is kind of like very perfectionist oriented, very like everything must be right. It's very black and white before you reach kind of a more mature perspective. And like anger is at the core of this idea of this personality. And so what this helped me understand about myself was that I would do almost anything not to acknowledge that I was angry.
Mm.
And the meaning I make of this is as a child, my dad was explosive at times and sometimes very threatening. And he and I have talked about this, and I've processed all of this on my own. So I'm not like sharing new revelations, and I learned to accommodate everyone around me and to be hypervigilant in response to this. And so if he was angry in what seemed like a physically threatening way to me, then responding with my own anger was a bad idea. On the flip side, my mom was uncomfortable with conflict. And so if I was angry with my mom, I'd often give her the silent treatment, and she would basically say, "That's not okay. Stop giving me the silent treatment." And what could have happened there was slight modification is, what are you feeling right now that has led you to give the silent treatment to me, right?
You couldn't express it because there was no room, and you weren't allowed to not express it because that felt
Exactly. Right. And so I ended up in this trap, which was, therefore, it's not okay. So
right.
Luckily, I don't feel that way now. And I've learned essentially that there is this superpower to just saying, I feel angry. And it's like all of this weight comes off my shoulders in the midst of that. But I notice this a lot. I'd say about 70% of my clients are women for whatever reason. I don't know how that happens, but I notice a lot with women, especially, that anger is this repressed thing that gets held for them and not expressed. And it's probably true for men in just totally different patterning. Anger and rage seem to be the category of emotion that is least acceptable to society from my seat. And I wonder what that is and what you've seen in terms of like healthy ways to process through it.
Yeah, this is a big one. I mean, I really feel for men because I feel like men are told anger is the only acceptable emotion for you to feel, but you can't express it in any way that makes anyone else feel it in a way that's uncomfortable for them. So there's this double bind, that you're dealing with. And then women, are sort of at the mercy of all of these complicated privilege dynamics that are likely to ignite anger, but then they're not allowed to express it either. So, we're all sort of dealing with this complicated dilemma. And it's important that we pay attention to our anger because it'll tell us what we care about. We don't get angry about things that don't matter. If you're angry about something, then it matters. It's a cue that it needs your attention, that it wants to be acknowledged in some way, either by you or by other people. And then the other thing I've found is anger is often just sad's bodyguard, that underneath anger is often sadness about something. And, if you can get to what's beneath it, that will be very generative. Something I learned in grad school at one point was, if a patient is stuck in anger, help them get to sadness. If a patient is stuck in sadness, help them get to anger. So these emotions will sort of protect each other. So for example, if you weren't allowed to be angry, but you were allowed to feel depressed, then maybe that was the place that you went, or vice versa. Then add to that there's a hell of a lot for us all to be really angry about right now. There is a lot going on that I think very rightfully deserves our indignation and anger. And we're then being told not to feel it or express it. And so there is this little act of rebellion. There is this like beautiful freedom in an unfree world that comes when you do exactly what you just said, which is say, I am angry about this. And so perhaps that is the kind of emotional push-up that we might all do this week, is voice and own our sadness and anger about something.
That really resonates with me. The therapeutic methodology that's just unlocked something really powerful for me is called internal family systems. I've talked about it a little bit on the show. I have a series of animated figures on my shelf that represent different parts.
The firefighter and
So I've got like a big old Batman with like a massive sword that is one of my protector parts, and it's representative of my anger. And it is often protecting a very young, sad version of me that's experiencing loss and grief at how the world really is, wishing this like naive wish that the world would be a really kind and thoughtful place, and having to confront all the ways in which it isn't. And this big Batman, like armored up figure is who shows up to protect that little naive part of me. And learning this about myself, and even the act of creating the show and talking about the topics that I talk about is an act of expressing the desire that younger part of me has for a more wholesome, engaged, kind, connected world. And that often means like I have to express my sadness at the degree to which that's not what I encounter day to day,
Yeah.
And it's been really beautiful to be able to get there.
I really love that because really we're all just children in adult armor. We are all just as much our 5-year-old self as we are our adult self. We've just learned to wrap that 5-year-old self in a whole bunch of protection and defenses and wisdom and all the things that we kind of acquire over time. But they're still in there and they still have all kinds of pull on us. And I've learned that in turning toward that part of myself, I gain a lot of agency in how much it actually makes my decisions for me.
Well, thank you for that. I want to wrap up with the three questions I always wrap up with.
Okay.
The first one is that I invite people on the show because of my own experience of their work, my admiration for them, the way they show up in the world. And of course, I could make it more specific and say the way you show up in the world, the way you write about mental health, the way you talk about it, the advocacy you do. And I wonder what you see yourself as being world-class at.
That's a cool question. I think I am world-class at taking complicated, overly jargony psychological concepts and explaining them in digestible, usable ways.
I agree with that. It's a great service to
Thanks.
everyone that you serve, I think. My second question is, what is the most beautiful version of the future that you're working to build through the work you do every day?
My version of the future that I'm working toward is one where it is as unremarkable to say that you're working on your emotional fitness as it is to say that you're working on your physical fitness. You know, someone saying, oh yeah, I'm going to get a quick workout in and then I'll meet you. I hope that pretty soon everyone's saying, yeah, let me just drop into this emotional fitness class and then I'll come meet you. You know, that we should be prioritizing it right alongside any other type of health.
One can only hope. We're on the way. Yeah. We're on the way.
We are.
My last one is who are you becoming as you do this work? As in your own journey, who are you becoming as a person right now?
You know, the first thing that comes to mind is I'm becoming a person who is realizing that a lot of the things that used to motivate me are not as important to me as I thought as I get them. So I was really a person who thought, oh, you know, I want a platform and I want my ideas to really be known. And then as that's happened more, I've thought, maybe that's not actually the most important thing. And maybe what's really most important to me is community and spaciousness and joy and learning and, you know, all these other things. So I feel like I am becoming more self-aware and more able to craft a new identity every day that feels most authentic to me.
That's really beautiful. Well, it's been a wonderful experience to get to have this conversation with you. And it's exactly what I hoped for in filling in the gaps between everything I've heard from you publicly. So thanks for joining me.
Oh, well, thank you. You are a delight of an interviewer, and I really appreciate what you do, and I'm honored to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Good Work. I'm your host, Barrett Brooks, and this podcast is produced by my friends over at Podcast Royale. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow Emily on Instagram or X. You can find her at Emily Anhalt. That's EmilYAnhalt. And be sure to check out her new book, Emotionally Fit, a guide to prioritizing your mental health no matter what life throws at you. It's smart, it's practical, and it's one of the best resources I've read on building emotional health over time. You can find full show notes at goodworkshow.com, including all the links and resources we mentioned, including to Emily's book, plus summaries of every past episode. If this is your first time listening, I hope you'll stick around. Hit follow on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss the next conversation. And of course, if you're already a subscriber, first of all, thank you. I'm very, very grateful to you. And secondly, I hope you'll pass along this conversation to one friend who's been thinking deeply about their emotional or entrepreneurial journey lately. You never know how much it might help. Thanks again for tuning in. I'll see you on the next episode.